Major issue journalists and the press have given me very little support on, and it's the population and endless growth issue. In fact, I consider I've failed on this issue, and until I got invited to this very welcome gathering, I thought it's a waste of time putting energy into it. It's interesting, during my business career, which started in 1969, my customers in effect have doubled. I don't own Dick Smith Electronics anymore, but it does $1.6 billion turnover. Started with a $610 investment back in 1969. So I've benefited from growth more than others. My fortune hasn't gone quite up as much, but I've done quite well. And most of that's come because you'd have to be a real mug as a capitalist if you can't make money when the population doubles. But I now have grandchildren, and it's created some unease. My little granddaughter, Charlie Brown, is 5. I was a free-range kid, and I was always told that each generation will be better off. My dad was a salesman, Mum was a homemaker or housewife. They could pay off a house on Sydney's North Shore with a backyard. All the kids had backyards. But when you look at what's happening now, young couples, normally both of them have to work, and quite often they can only afford a unit in a high-rise. In fact, we've gone from free-range kids to kids that are like termites. I noticed they're now building 80-storey units at Parramatta to try and hold Sydney's population, which is to go from 4 million to 8 million. Now, Kevin Rudd, who was mentioned before, talked about a big Australia of 36 million. In fact, even in today's growth rates, we're looking forward to going to, or against, I would say, to about 80 to 100 million by the end of the century if we keep growing. And it's interesting because I think actually we could hold 100 million in this country. It'd be great for wealthy people because they have more customers, but for most Australians it's worse. The cake is a certain size, mainly coming from our mineral reserves and our primary production from farming, and double the population. I believe everyone's worth half as much. Now, some people would say, oh no, but you've got more workers. Well, yes, if we're making little bits and pieces in factories, that might be so. But in the modern world with automation, that's unlikely. Now, it's interesting, I didn't want my little granddaughter at the end of this century, when she's still likely to be alive, to say that Dick Smith, my grandfather, he was supposed to be a person of influence. Why didn't he do anything about this? Our quality of life has dropped dramatically. And of course, we don't know that for sure because there's no plan. I started learning as much as I could. I read this wonderful book by Mark O'Connor from Canberra, Overloading Australia, and then I produced my own little book about population and a documentary on the ABC. But what I couldn't believe is that I got virtually no response from the journalists. It was as if it was something you couldn't talk about. I became a disciple of the Labor politician from Melbourne, Kelvin Thompson. Kelvin, I notice you're there. And it was obvious that he was a person of lots of common sense in what he was saying. And I remember saying to him, how can you get away with this? And he said, well, I get away with it for two things. First of all, the media virtually gives me no coverage. And secondly, Dick, most people agree with what I'm saying. Remember, Kelvin comes from an ethnic community with people from all around the world. But his belief is that our immigration shouldn't be something like 250,000 a year. It should be something like 75,000 a year, which is very high by world standards for developing countries, but would allow us to start to stabilise our population. So it was clear to me we needed a discussion and a plan. And what was interesting, after I published the book, which sold 9,000 copies, which they say is not too bad, I got the most incredible support from the Australian public. I'd be stopped in the street and people would say, Dick, thanks for saying it how it is, we agree with what you're saying, but very little coverage in the media. And it's interesting, I worked out that the driver of the problem was our economic system, and that is the economic system we've had since the Second World War is one which requires endless compound growth in population and the uses of resources and energy. Otherwise, it will go into recession. Now, that's clearly not sustainable. It's a finite world. You can't have endless growth. And even my right-wing capitalistic mates who believe we should have growth all the time all admit, well, yes, Dick, you're right, there is a limit, but it's a distance away, so let's not worry about it. It's clearly not sustainable what we're doing. And as we're starting to get to the limits of easy growth, we're getting to what I call extreme capitalism. And with Dick Smith Foods, I've been dealing with the people near the top, not right at the top, but near the top of Woolworths and Coles. And as you know, Coles and Woolies have been criticised because they're so ruthless. And these senior managers on both companies have said to me, "Oh, Dick, by the way, you're right with what you're saying. We don't enjoy our jobs anymore. You have to be so ruthless because the shareholders insist on never-ending profit increases." And as you know, Woolworths, the largest operator of poker machines in the world. I don't know what Coles will be taking over next, but it's this madness that we're in where you have to have endless growth in profits, otherwise the shares will drop down in value. So they took me aside and they told me this, and lots of other people agreed that it was a very important point. I read this fantastic book by Prince Charles on harmony, and he says exactly what I've been saying and Kelvin Thompson has been saying. Harmony, he says, basically you have to live in balance. And to me, here he is, the future King of England, who is saying these things quite openly, but getting virtually no coverage in the media. And I also produced a magazine. It was called Dick Smith's Magazine of Forbidden Ideas. 2.4 million copies. I put it in virtually all the media around Australia. What you won't read about in the mainstream media, that's meaning you journalists wouldn't cover it. It says here, will endless growth hit the wall and destroy our way of life? Free-range kids, are they better? 100 million population for Australia with a question mark. An extreme capitalism, is it good? And it was interesting, after that magazine went out, I got the most incredible coverage from the typical Australians, thousands and thousands of letters of email of support saying, "Dick, what you're just saying is common sense. Why aren't more people talking about it?" And it's interesting, I was told, "Oh, Dick, the reason journalists don't talk about it is when they work for the commercial media, they have to have endless growth and there's no way they're going to doubt what's giving their boss a bonus and keeping the share value up." But I found that that clearly wasn't so, because the ABC, and I'm talking particularly about news and current affairs, they seem to be the greatest growth spruikers, and there obviously is not any pressure on profit growth there. And it was interesting, I launched the Wilberforce Award, which is $1 million to go to a young person somewhere in the world, under 30, who becomes famous in mentioning and making clear that we can't have perpetual growth. And the ABC news journalist was sent to the launch. I had $1 million in cash, and I had 5 beautiful blonde bombshells, because Richard Branson used to come here and launch anything from a shop to a credit card, and he always had 4 beautiful blonde bombshells, and it was always on the media, including the ABC. So I thought, I'll have 5. So I had 5 beautiful blonde bombshells. It made no difference. In fact, the ABC journalist who'd been sent with the film crew asked me 3 questions about racism. And I said, it's nothing to do with racism. This growth issue is a world problem. It covers every creed, religion, colour of skin. If you're going to go from 7 billion to 10 people on this earth, as we need to because we have to have perpetual growth, it's not possible to have 10 billion people with a reasonable standard of living, who are well-fed, who can be kept warm. And it was interesting, that night, because she couldn't link it to racism, nothing appeared. And then I wrote to Tony Jones of Q&A and said, "Why don't you cover the growth issue?" And he actually came back and said, "I take your point, Dick. I'll forward it on to the executive producer, Peter McCoy." But nothing has been covered on growth, except not so long ago on the doubt of growth issue on Q&A. Q&A actually ran a night where they had the head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, there. And I thought, fantastic, because it was obvious from the promo that she was going to be spruiking up growth. And it was interesting, when the show started, as you know, the Twitter feeds come up. And the first 2 Twitter feeds were, "Growth is not the solution, it's the problem, it's unsustainable." And then the next one was, "Growth is unsustainable and hopeless. Everyone knows that." I thought, this is fantastic. There's going to be some discussion on growth. But there was none. It wasn't mentioned at all, other than growth being positive. There was no one doubting, no one reflected those Twitter feeds, and from that point on, either no Twitter was allowed to actually put that query there, or more likely, maybe they just didn't think that it was the issue. And this lady spruiked growth as if it was unending. when I know that most of the population are concerned about this. So finally, we need to have a plan. I believe we can have a viable economic system based on capitalism but with a different form of growth. Growth in quality and efficiency, but not in endless growth in population and the use of resources and energy. I'm positive we can. Now look at Japan. It's going to go from 120 million to 90 million. But the quality of life is improving. Now, the economists will tell you what a basket case Japan is. I've been there with my wife in recent times. Looks pretty good to me. And they're spending the money that we'd have to spend on trying to build endless freeways and more high-rise buildings. They're spending on improving their lifestyle. And it's interesting, go into a shopping centre and about half what's there is actually pretty useless. You don't really need it. But if we stop buying it, our whole economic system collapses. So I'm not saying for a second that we should stop growth. We can't. But we should have discussion on how we move to a system that's truly sustainable, where we're actually living in balance, or as Prince Charles would say, harmony. Once we do that, I think we can have a great future for our grandchildren. Thank you for listening to me.